Um, Before we get into today, so let me just kind of lay out for you what we'll do. First, just got a couple check-in things at the beginning. Then we're going to take up until about 7:45 to go over the Wilson reading from the last couple days, and we'll sort of talk through his 4 pages of the sermon, and we will talk about the first couple of sections, the first couple of pages more in depth in terms of trouble in the text and trouble in the world. And then about 7:45 or so, Sarah Dirk will join us and we'll have some time with her to discuss her sermon. And I have a series of questions that I'm going to go ahead and ask all of our guests that we have coming to, because we have, I think, 4 or 5 guests through the semester that we'll have come to class. Because preaching is so personal and different for each person, it's just good for you to get a variety of voices. So I have a series of questions that I'll be asking, but you should also feel free if you have particular questions that you want to ask her about her preaching practice or about the particular sermon you've heard, you can feel free to do that too. So we'll talk to Sarah till a little bit after 8, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back for about half an hour at the end and discuss some of the Barbara Brown Taylor reading for this week. And we didn't get to it last week, so we'll also talk about some of the first couple chapters of Barbara Brown Taylor's work. So all good there? Everybody clear? All right, on with the show then. So first thing is, I discovered that in the syllabus, just as a quick check-in thing, I discovered in the syllabus that the grading scale is a little bit off. I did not include a B- number in there, and so everything's a little screwy. So I'm going to go ahead and take care of that this week and amend that. But just to be clear, that what you see in there now, it'll change a little bit. It shouldn't, I don't think it'll impact the way that you approach the course or anything. But just be aware that that grade scale will need to change. So I just had the course, it just went through our, I don't know what her role or what her title is exactly. Cynthia Simmons oversees a lot of the online education stuff. So she was combing through the course Moodle and finding some things I hadn't done correctly. So anyway, we'll get those minor things straightened out, but just to be aware that that'll change in the next week. With that, why don't I go ahead and share screen, and we will just kind of jump into thinking through this method of sermon prep. And like I say, for me, there are many ways to write a sermon. For me, following Paul Scott Wilson's idea of the 4 pages of the sermon was the most helpful thing for me in getting started in preaching. And even though I don't follow it completely to a T now every time I preach, almost every time I preach, it's inflected. You can see elements of his thinking that have really, again, 20 years after I first read it, have really just become part of the way that I approach the preaching task. So let me go ahead and share screen and we'll get started. All right. All right, so the 4 pages of the sermon. Paul wants us to be thinking basically about literally, from his mind, taking an 8.5 by 11 page 4 days out of your week and focusing each day on 1 page and going deep into a particular angle on the text each of those days. So those 4 pages are trouble in the text, and that's the first thing, and you spent some time reading about that more in detail. But the idea is, in every biblical text, there are multiple points of tension, and Wilson's language is in or behind the text. So you might read a story, for example, that has a very obvious point of tension, or you might be reading an epistle, which might just look like advice or a friendly letter. And in that case, some of the tension the trouble might be behind the text. It might be something we understand more about the more that we know about the person who wrote the letter, the people who are receiving the letter. And so it may be something within the text itself, or maybe something kind of behind the text in the people who are implied as being involved with producing or reading the text in some way. And again, we'll go deep into all these things. But second thing is trouble in the world. And Wilson's idea is that when we get to know the tension that's going on in a particular biblical text, we should then be able to make a connection with some kind of difficulty that's going on in our world. Now, Wilson is going to say, you should always let the text lead. And I'm going to poke him a little bit on that because that's not exactly how I approach it. We can talk about that a little later. But for Wilson anyway, he would say, as you look at the text, you should begin to think about how does the tension that's present in this text look like a tension that I might experience in my own life. So to take sort of one kind of basic example, right? If you're reading the beginning of the book of Genesis and you read about, you know, um, Adam and Eve are not to eat from the tree that's in the middle of the garden. I mean, there's a significant point of tension, right? There's this temptation. There's this thing that's beautiful to look at and seems like you should be eating it, but you're not supposed to. And you know it's tempting, and and from there, you're able to take that tension in the text and say, we've all experienced temptation. Like, does that make sense? Like those kinds of things, making that connection between the tension you see in the text and the way it looks like a tension that people experience in their own lives. Um, at times, this could be really intuitive, and so you don't need to make much of an argument for it, right? Like in what I just shared with you, it's fairly intuitive. At times, you'll be taking people to realize there's trouble in the world that they're not even really thinking about from time to time. Does that make sense? Like, not, there's all kinds of suffering going on in the world around us that many people sort of live in ignorance of. And part of the job we have as preachers is to kind of make them aware that God is moving in the middle of those things too. And so there may be more education to be done in the trouble in the world section, or it might just be a chance for you to sort of acknowledge people's suffering that they're already feeling. But for Wilson, this is where a good sermon starts, is by elucidating that kind of trouble that's going on in the Bible and saying, it's like something human that we all experience, and kind of universalize it, take it out of the text. Third, then, we look at God's action in the text. So how is God speaking into the tension that's being felt? What's God doing? And so again, if you're thinking about that Genesis text at the beginning, God could be, there's several actions of God that happen right after the people violate God's commandment, right? So God's the one who gives the commandment, but then when people mess up, God comes and meets them in the garden. God calls out to them. When they continue to hide from God, God knits clothing for them. There are several things that God does that you could draw attention to, that God does to sort of speak to that tension that people are feeling. And being able to look at each text like a story, and being able to sort of follow it like a story and say, there's a dramatic rise, there's tension, there's something going on, and then God is speaking into it and bringing good out of it in some way. He may be encouraging people to do something. He may be announcing grace in some way. And next week, we'll talk deeply about what it looks like to talk about God's action in the text. But for now, just suffice it to say, there's a way that God is speaking into it to bring resolution, to bring his good out of it, to encourage people in a certain direction. All of these things can be ways that we talk about God's action in the text. And here, then, is the kind of fourth page, and ultimately the kind of hopeful application of the sermon is, then if this is the way that God speaks into that kind of tension, if we experience the same kind of tension, we can expect that God wants to speak into our tension in the world, our trouble, in the same way he did in the scripture. And so, again, I mean, if you're thinking about that Genesis story, this is not something I thought about before, but, if you draw attention to God's knitting or making clothes out of animal skins for people, this is your chance to say, like, when we mess up, God still loves us and cares for us and meets us where we are, and takes care of our basic needs. Even though we've spurned his way and haven't done what's best, he still meets us where we are, even though we've screwed up in a way that doesn't honor him. So that's for Wilson. This is where a healthy sermon lives. You got to know the tension, and you've got to begin to sort of imaginatively say, how's God speaking into it, and then speak into our own situation in the same way. So let me pause here. I mean, that's the major thrust of this book, and that's where we're going to live this week and next week. So let's just stop here. Like, your reaction to this, questions you have, and also, does this sound like preaching as it's been modeled for you? Can you see elements of this in the way that people have preached that you know well, that you admire their preaching? Not so chatty tonight. That's fine. We might get there. But let me also.
I do,
Go ahead, Brian.
I do kind of see this pattern. Now that I'm identified to it, I kind of try to pick it out now. I try to pull sections and I notice that it's not always in this order,
That's
which
great.
is once you realize this is kind of what people are following sometimes, and it's not, you can kind of see the orders. And when he also talks in the different stages, which I don't want to get ahead, when he talks about putting a story with it and identify things in your own life and around people, people put that in different places.
Yep.
And some people build two or three different stories into a sermon.
Yep. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Yeah, and it's well, yeah, several things there, but I think particularly the way that preaching like this is much more flexible. Like I say, I rarely follow the 4 pages precisely now, but I might choose to jump on initially by talking about some sort of deeply felt need that people are feeling. Like often that's what we do when we have like some kind of national emergency that we're talking about or something we feel like we need to address. We start by talking about trouble in the world, and then we remind people, oh, God, this is not new to God. There's an example in the scripture of where people experience the same kind of thing we're experiencing now. It's really important to see, and I don't think that you will all struggle with this as much as traditional undergraduate students. Um, it's very common for traditionally like undergraduate students to think about preaching primarily as teaching, where when they want to sort of they want to take a long time to build an argument for why a particular interpretation of the text is the right interpretation. And I just want to say this really clearly. It's very important that you are faithful interpreters of the Bible, but the goal of a sermon is not necessarily to show that interpretation to everybody and to argue why your interpretation is the right interpretation. You know, if you're trying to make a pivot from trouble in the text to trouble in the world, it can really bog a sermon down if you say, here are 3 reasons why this thing that's going on in Genesis 2 is like what's going on now. Much better to say, this thing we experience we see in Genesis 2, we experience this now. And you know, to not feel like you need to build an academic argument into the sermon is a really important thing. And like I say, when I'm talking to like 20-year-olds who are just their whole experience is school, that's the first thing they want to do in a sermon is like do all the exegesis and then show you in the sermon that they've done all of it. And you just don't need to do that. It's more asserted than argued, I think, generally in preaching. Let me jump in then. Just Wilson says, let's boil each of these things down to a sentence, and these sentences will be the guiding structure of the sermon. So this is on page 73, at least in this one. It's the very end of section 1. Just seeing the very end of chapter 3. So Joseph, I know that you're working with an older version there, but he just lists, you know, sermons about Exodus 20, the 10 commandments. Page 1, Israel needs help. The commandments are given to correct certain behavior. Do you see how that's an example of trouble that's going on behind the text? Right? When we read the 10 commandments, there's not trouble there, it's just a list of rules. But the idea that, wow, there's this group of people who are wandering in the wilderness who don't have a sense of how they're supposed to order their lives. That's the tension, right? Page 2 then is we need help. There are ways in our lives where we are wandering in the wilderness, as it were, and in need of God's direction. Then page 3 is the giving of the commandments themselves. God gives the way to life. Here are the 10 commandments. This is the way to live. And for us, then page 4, God gives us life in the middle of it. And we could make that go any number of directions, but probably the most faithful to the text would be to say, God gives us principles that we live by. We see some of those elucidated in the 10 commandments. And then throughout the scripture, you know, we see clearly when God says, this is the way, walk in it. And so, yeah, that's one example, Exodus 20. You can see Isaiah's call. Isaiah feels unworthy is page 1 in Isaiah 6. Then page 2, many feel unworthy like that. And you can appreciate how a certain kind of emotional intelligence is really helpful for preaching this way, right? Like when you are able to sort of put yourself in Isaiah's shoes and say, wow, he was really feeling the weight of it. Then, again, a certain kind of emotional intelligence is going to make you think, was there ever a time I felt like that? Or Was there a time when someone I knew was just like really battling this? Or is there some example in history when, someone was just really battling this? Or was there a movie I saw when someone was feeling that kind of insecurity? Um, so the better you're able to kind of identify what Isaiah was feeling, the more adjectives you can put on it, the greater detail you can use to describe it, the more likely you are to see some kind of resonance with something that you're experiencing in the world outside, be it your personal life, something you're reading or watching, historical, whatever. So then page 3, God gives Isaiah a new identity. And then page 4, God gives us a new identity as servants of Christ. So again, for Wilson, the 4 pages themselves, he has other things that he focuses on, one need toward the end of the sermon. I just mostly want you to think about the pages and to think like that's what I want to see in your practice sermons. I want to see evidence that you're kind of learning how to use those pages. Yeah, as long as you're doing that, I'm not as concerned with the kind of things he's doing with the conclusions or other things. The raising of Lazarus, obviously, I mean, the trouble there is Lazarus's death. Jesus seems late today, right? Like Jesus seems to have delayed while something in us is dying or something has gone wrong. Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. Jesus raises us. So anyway, at some point, I'm not sure if we'll have time today or if we'll wait till next week to do it. I'm going to split you up into smaller groups, just into groups of 2 or 3, to have you practice with some texts and come back with some of the 4 pages as you would write them up. Any questions on kind of what that might look like? And does it make sense to you? I don't know if anything is unclear, but let's talk about it now if so.
I'm just curious how this works with a more topical sermon, because I think like I've never preached before, but I think my style is just a little bit more like topical and then grabbing scriptures from all over to kind of support the general theme.
Yep.
But I'm having trouble fitting the 2 together.
Yeah, let me just put the next point up here since it'll be salient to what you're saying. Wilson suggests that either page 1 or 3 should lead. That's how Wilson feels, like he's very text driven. I'm not so sure. And part of that, Heather, I think is what you're talking about. I think Wilson's idea is, and probably because he's from a tradition that uses what we call the lectionary. I don't know how many of you are from that kind of tradition, but in some churches, you have to, you have a text that's given to you that you have to preach on as opposed to choosing your own text. And so for him, it's important to just kind of live in the text and look for resonances in the world outside. For me, sometimes a sermon comes that way, where I'm reading the Bible and I feel a certain kind of connection with a text. But often it comes from a sense of what the people I'm talking to need to hear. So like this semester in our chapel, we're talking about mental health because I know that since we have classes like 14 weeks in a row this semester, like it's an unusual semester here, and I knew mental health was going to be a struggle. So for me, I'm actually leaning into page 2 first, usually is how I think about it, right? I'm experiencing people's trouble with them and for them. And instead of sort of going to the scripture and hoping that I can make a leap, instead, when I'm reading the scripture, I'm reading with those lenses in mind. And I'm just like Wilson would say, like, if you've got the text in mind, then you're going to see other things in the world that kind of make that connection. I'm thinking like I'm reading the text with the world in mind, and I'm seeing texts that help make that connection. So I'm, Wilson's ideal is, you're walking about your day and you're like, oh, that's just like what happened in Genesis 1. Whereas I'm saying like, oh, when I look at Genesis 1 or when I look at Leviticus 12 or whatever, when I'm looking with these lenses, I'm able to see tension in the text that's like what people are experiencing in the world now. And I think it's, again, for me, it's just more of a matter of pastoral style, like if you're kind of a deeply empathetic person, you're probably carrying a lot of people's troubles around with you anyway, and they're impacting the way that you're reading the text and the way you're looking at life. So I'm much more comfortable with pages 2 or 4 leading than Wilson is. Does that help?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Other thoughts, reactions to this idea? Okay, well, let's jump into trouble a little more then. Let's take some time here. Trouble in the Bible. So when we're talking about trouble and kind of how to kind of name it, who is facing the trouble? If you've got a story that you're reading, if it's a narrative passage, obviously there are all kinds of characters that you can look at and say, oh, this character is experiencing trouble. In many texts, there are more than one character who are experiencing trouble. If you take a classic text like the prodigal son, right? You could talk about trouble from the standpoint of the younger son. You can talk about the trouble of the older son. You can talk about the trouble of the father. And what you choose might depend on who you're talking to, right? There are all kinds of angles that you could work there. And you can be really, really creative. I mean, to me, this is where healthy creativity and healthy imagination really shine, as we're going to talk about uh, in the African American preaching tradition, particularly being so imaginative. Sometimes in a white evangelical context, we talk about imagination in almost a derisive way, but imagination is a really helpful thing to look at a text to say, not only the famous people in the text, but who else was experiencing trouble? Not just Jesus and Zacchaeus, but the people who are watching also are going through their own kind of emotional journey. And being able to read the text and imagine you're there in one of the various roles can be really good. Um, you read a story like David and Bathsheba and her husband Uriah. I mean, there are all kinds of people to read that through. Even the commander of the Israelite army, right? I mean, you could read that text through many, many different lenses. And again, it will depend. This is to me where a real pastoral art of knowing your people comes in. If I'm talking about the prodigal son, I'm going to talk to people my age differently than I'm going to talk to college students about it. I'm going to focus on the father for people my age, and I'm going to talk about one of the sons for, if I'm preaching at Houghton, I might focus on the older son because Houghton has lots of students there who have been like the older son and very responsible. And, I may talk about the younger son at another kind of gathering. So there are lots of characters, and you should be thinking creatively about the different characters you see. Others who are tangentially connected to the story. So, like, this is what he meant by behind the text, right? So, if there's a prophecy that you're reading, for instance, knowing who the prophecy is written to and who the prophet is that's writing it, that's really helpful. Something from the mouth of Isaiah is different than something from the mouth of Obadiah. And the people who they're talking to can be really different across the prophets as well. So think about who's kind of addressed, who's connected. So people to whom the text is addressed. So if you're reading an epistle, what do you know about the church at Ephesus? What do you know about Corinth? Um, you know, I remember once, and I will not always claim to be a I will not lean on myself as a great preacher, but one thing I'm really proud of, I remember when I was a local pastor, was realizing Corinth was located in a place that was like right along both major um, land trade routes and sea trade routes because of where it was located. It was like on a little isthmus between, like a little strip of land that held together two larger areas. And so it was the kind of place where, because of all the trade that went through there, it was very, people moved in and out very often. I'm forgetting the word I'm thinking of here, but people moved frequently. They didn't really set down roots there. And so when I realized that, I was like, oh, I'm preaching in the Philadelphia suburbs in a very similar town. Our town didn't really have a town center, and there was a lot of shopping and a lot of big corporations near there, but nobody really lived there, except for there were like apartment complexes where people would live for a few years and then generally move somewhere else. And so I, took about 10 weeks to preach on Corinthians, but really leaned into that every week, saying, we're like Corinth in a sense, and all of the stuff that comes from being in an area where people don't really set down roots. There's less attention to, if you lived in a small town where you've lived all your life, you generally were very well behaved, but Corinth wasn't like that. It's where people kind of did things because they were liberated from their ties that bind in their hometown. And so we just talked about that and how that was similar to the place that we lived. So you can build a lot around knowing just little bits of information, really. The writer of the text is also a character. So, if you're preaching a psalm, to know something about the psalmist, who's the poet who's writing in the wisdom literature, especially, to know a little bit about the various kind of authorship ideas. The author is also a character. Poor are also a frequent unnamed and rather imprecise character in many stories and Psalms. But, Psalms certainly address God's concern for the poor, which makes the poor themselves people who face trouble that God speaks on behalf of. So being aware, just thinking creatively about who is facing trouble in any biblical text. God's people. That's another, that sometimes texts are addressed more broadly. And so the people that, the Israelites kind of figure in the background of a lot of biblical texts. And so being able to think about it from the masses of the Israelites. How do we describe trouble? He's real big on talking about filming the action. So, take with that what you will. I mean, you don't need to, I'm not so big on you have to do this exactly his way, but his idea of filming is just showing rather than telling as being very important, and taking more time to kind of demonstrate instead of relentlessly explain as being really important. So he says on page 91, retell the text, make it come alive, treat it as real life now. Don't rush the story, keep the focus on the text for a minimum of a few minutes. The story is in the details. Draw concrete details, not out of thin air, but from online and other resources, like a Bible dictionary that you can learn about. Use present tense, that's really important, like bring people into the present by acting as if the text is happening in front of you right now. I think his film metaphor is a little over the top at times, but I do appreciate this idea of storytelling and keeping the viewer in mind and making it image rich as being pretty important. The points he makes in chapter 5, develop trouble. If you think about a personal difficulty that you're facing, something you'd say is troubling you, odds are you could tell the story of how it got to be such a trouble. And it would be a story that would take a while to kind of explain. And in the same way, you humanize the characters in the story when you kind of build up by explaining why people might feel the way they did. What's the history there? How did this trouble come to be? Again, I'm just drawing a text off my top of my head, but thinking about, Mary finds herself pregnant with Jesus. I mean, to talk about what that would have meant in that culture and the feelings that must have accompanied Mary, to kind of go into that a little bit and give, part of what's going to help you make the leap from the trouble in the text to people's lives is the sense of there's a very universal reality in the middle of these troubles that as you describe them, you begin to see that this is not just one person going through things, but that all human suffering is kind of related. And the fact that we go through suffering together can help each other. So take time to develop it. Speak to one need or longing. That's really important. The greatest temptation when you're starting to preach is to preach more than one sermon at one time. And it's wonderful now to be able to preach frequently, so I know I don't have to do that. So focus in, as you're developing the story, don't take a long time to sort of explain some detail that's really not serving your main point. As they say with all good writing, like make sure it serves the thesis statement. And make sure that you're not wasting words on doing something that's not illustrating the trouble that you're trying to illustrate. So one dominant image. Again, try to keep, if you have too many kinds of dominant stories or images, people will not remember any of them, or they will just feel like there's a jumble of ideas. But if you can keep coming back to one picture again and again, pretty important. Employ the senses, and that's something he mentions before, but just, can you, and this comes through in Sarah Dirk's sermon that you were supposed to listen to for today, but like, can you smell the rosewater perfume, right? Like, can you, like she was using that to talk about her own life, but there are ways that you can employ the senses in similar ways when retelling a biblical story. Find a fresh perspective, like, sermons, like, I don't know, as we're talking about example texts like the prodigal son, for instance, it's amazing how often preachers just kind of copy each other, and just kind of preach the same sermon because that's what people expect, instead of sort of saying, well, what's a different angle? You know, what are, I've never thought about it from this angle before, or, you know, and at least in the brainstorming stage, there aren't bad ideas. Now there are some bad sermons, so I don't want to say that you can't do anything wrong. You certainly can. But you know, I mean, if you're trying to brainstorm, like, what kind of character do I want to focus on their trouble? And I don't know, take time to think about something crazy and different, and just kind of hold it up to the light a little bit and see what's there. But many sermons just suffer from, you know, falling back into tropes that are just, people already know what you're going to say before you say it, and that's not helpful. Finally, and I think this is really important, know the characters. And I don't I don't mean to say, I think this is partly a gift that some people have, but it is a skill that can also be learned. So take time to really get to know the characters in a story. Imagine them as people. Imagine yourself meeting them. Imagine what kind of interaction and conversation you'd have with them. Um, do whatever you have to do to save them from just being words on the page, but to really humanize them. Because what's going to make this particular method of preaching really powerful is the preacher has seen this person as a real human being. And because of that, I know I can trust the preacher to understand me as a real human being. But so your ability to not fall just into kind of cliche in looking at the characters, but to really know them with as much clarity as you can really know them. And I say partly that's a gift. Like some among you are more kind of pastoral than others and kind of intuit things about people, but part of it's a skill. Like part of it is, you know, you learn how to use Bible dictionaries and commentaries and other things that kind of give you the data you need to begin to understand people as people. So this is really like what you want to do as much as you can is knowing, treating the people as people and really elevating their story, including just diving into the tension they're feeling and really elevating it, really putting it out there. When you're looking at trouble in the world, then a lot of the similar things here, but let me just put a few of them out there. Just like in the text, you're trying to like make people understand the characters as fully human. Here, your job as a preacher is to surface feelings. I don't know quite how to say it other than that. There are frustrations that many people are walking around with that they can't articulate. And the fact that you as a preacher care enough about them and are skilled enough pastorally to say, that thing you're concerned about, God is concerned about too, and shows us in his word that he's concerned about. You get to bring these feelings up to the surface for people. And that's a gift. So, you know, so that's an important part. So examples on page 113, 115, let me just grab those there. He talks about vertical trouble and horizontal trouble, and says sometimes we want to slip into vertical trouble, things that people have done wrong, where God is kind of above us looking down and saying, the trouble is here is that you're not getting it right. You must repent. You have failed God. You have not loved your neighbor as yourself. Honor your parents. Whereas 115 talks about horizontal trouble, trouble that comes from being a person, which is related to our relationship with God, but doesn't have a neat kind of tidy correspondence one-to-one like the vertical trouble. So our times bring anxiety. This woman suffers from cancer. Life seems meaningless to many. Many have been left unemployed. Racism is ongoing. Wars continue in the world. Global warming threatens life as we know it. So these can be things that are personal. These can be things that are cosmic. But just being able to say, there's lots of trouble in the world, and God cares about all of it. And God speaks to so much of it in his word, but you've got to be able to be aware of that kind of trouble. There's a table that's on page 117, a couple pages out, where it just talks about the difference between judgment and empathy. And we're going to, of course, talk a lot more about empathy in the last book we read in this text. But instead of focusing on things like consumerism and greed, which definitely are problems, and yes, people are guilty of them, but to realize that consumerism and greed is often rooted in fear there will not be enough. Right? Consumerism and greed are logical but sinful responses to the fear that people have that they won't have enough. So instead of hammering home, don't be so consumeristic, don't be so greedy, acknowledging the fear that we will not have enough and exposing that, holding it to the light and helping people see, well, maybe consumerism and greed is not what we have to do. Maybe God has something different in mind for us to address this fear. Teaching with global awareness, so helping people to understand and appreciate the trouble that's going on in them, surface it, but also helping them to appreciate that everyone around them is going through difficulty. And I will just say, like, this takes time as a preacher, I think, to do well, because it's very tempting today, I think, as a preacher, to one of the ways that we shore up connection with other people is by having a common enemy. And it's very tempting for a preacher to then appeal to an audience by sort of appealing to a common enemy. It's dangerous to be a Christian today. There are people kind of out to get us, is the idea. So being able to sort of increase people's empathy so that they're not perceiving, because if you do that enough, then people will perceive we really are surrounded by enemies. This is a dangerous world instead of, this is a world that God's in. Yes, there are dangers, but God doesn't leave us alone in the middle of those dangers. And so preaching with an awareness of trying to help people humanize the people around them is pretty important. Obviously, what you're looking to do is to parallel the trouble in the text. In the end, that's your goal, is to sort of say, what's going on in the text is like something that we're feeling. And if you can do that with as much specificity and clarity as you can, you have the makings of a really good sermon. If you are able to sort of get at whatever that vague feeling of ennui or frustration or whatever, if you can say, this is like what's going on in the biblical text in a way that is authentic to the text and authentic to the people, and remember, authentic to you as a preacher, you're really, really on your way. So filming this too, and we talked about that before, like kind of use the same kind of sensory approach, tell stories empathetically, let the trouble build gradually, that kind of thing. Last thing I'll say, and then we can open it up for some questions here before Sarah joins us. For me, this is a very deeply spiritual kind of reality. And I think getting yourself ready spiritually to preach this way is actually, for me, most of the battle. I think for some of you who may be more advanced than me spiritually, you may be there and may just want to develop competency. But for me, I found that the competency falls into place when I'm spiritually ready to do this. Like the ability to look at my life and be honest about the trouble that's going on in it, that's a spiritual kind of thing, right? So let me get into this before we break into questions here. So first, be aware of your own trouble. Many people go around in the world today functionally unaware of why they are angry or why they are sad, and really afraid to look at it. And we can be really self-deceptive about that. Like if you know you're angry, or even if you don't know you're angry, like if you just know I'm frustrated or sad or angry a lot, it's so easy for us to say, and I would be all better if it were just not for other people. If other people would only change, then I would be better. We can be really self-deceptive and not want to look at our own trouble and clearly sort out what is mine and what belongs to other people. And so to be in touch with your own anxiety and your own anger and your own shortcomings is just so, so important. You can't wish that away. In fact, when I feel anxious about something now, it's often at that time when I realize now this is when I need to be writing a sermon, because I'm very aware with granular precision of what's going on. It's like because it's so dominant in me, that feeling right now I'm going through something really frustrating, because I'm feeling it, this is the time to write about it, because when I'm feeling about it, I can describe it in amazing detail. And if I'm not feeling angry in the moment, I might just be able to put it aside and not really remember it very well. But when I'm feeling it, something really rises. So being aware of your own trouble is just so, so important. And again, Heather's question before, I mean, for me, many good sermons, I think, have been born out of an awareness of what's going on inside of me, and a moment when I've been reading the scripture for something totally different. But it's like, I've realized this connection with this thing that I'm carrying around. And only because I can describe what I'm carrying around can I really make that connection in an authentic way. So be aware of your own trouble. create room for other people's trouble in your life. And I mean that as a spiritual practice, right? Like if people are coming to talk to you, particularly if you're in ministry and you regularly don't have time for people. And again, this doesn't mean every time someone comes by, you have to make time for them. But it's just to say, if you regularly can't make kind of emotional space or time for people, we've got a problem. So being aware of other people's trouble and allowing them to feel troubled around you is really important. And it's hard to do because we have enough trouble of our own, right? Like we don't want to hear other people's trouble sometime. We're frustrated, not frustrating. We are frustrated that we can't solve it. Like sometimes we don't want people to tell us about their problems because it pains us that we can't make it better and it makes us feel inadequate and frustrated. Problems can be inconvenient. We know that if someone shares their story with the church, it's going to really make it hard for the church. And so we just don't want people to talk about the things that they're feeling. Or we feel guilty, right? That, we feel like this person is blaming us for their problem, and that feeling is overwhelming. So all that to say is, if we regularly kind of keep people from experiencing their frustration, or if we don't encounter it with them, then how are we supposed to know what our people are feeling? How are we supposed to have that moment where when we're looking at the scripture, we realize, oh, this would really speak to Annie as she is feeling this deeply painful thing, if we don't know what Annie's feeling? So for us, this is where the pastoral and the preacher really come together, being able to lean into what other people are feeling and acknowledge it. The more we experience trouble, the better we are at feeling it, the better we are at preaching it, the better we are at describing it. So just get used to leaning into trouble a little bit, and being able to see the difficulties that you're going through in your life as something that's kind of enabling you to speak the word of God more clearly when it comes time for you to speak it. So I have just thrown a bunch of stuff at you. Anything particularly that you want to talk about or ask here as we're winding up? I've gone into a lot of detail about how to preach trouble, but I think if I can boil it down, it's mostly a matter of, again, kind of trying to be faithful with all of the exegetical tools that you have, right? To learn about what trouble is going on in the biblical text, but also developing that pastoral art, that pastoral ear, to not run away from trouble, but to sort of, at the moment where trouble is striking, this is your chance to lean in and to learn in more depth what people are feeling. And you're going to be able to remember that diagram I showed you last week of kind of speaking authentically from who you are, authentically to what the text is, and authentically to what your people are feeling. This is going to give you the data you need to do that, because we live in a world of trouble. And so it's going to help you to do that really well if you're in tune with your own drama, and if you're in tune with the drama going on around you. It's going to make you more equipped to do it. Do you all feel equipped to go preach the first half of a good sermon anyway? Go ahead, Brian. Yeah.
I think the one thing that I got most about it is it seems like he tries to make the point of it, trying to link the pages together. And at one point he uses a term or a way it's called, and I think that I'm saying this right, metonymic, where he has a word from each section.
Oh, mnemonics.
Yeah. That kind of puts it together. And it seems like it's a constant theme of trying to link things together without having 4 or 5 different sections you're trying to get someone to understand. Yes.
Yeah, my advice with this, and this again, I mean, every preacher will do this differently. My advice is just, I get by with using very few words to make those changes, to be able to say, like, that feeling that you are seeing in Adam, we all feel that, don't we? We feel it when blank, and then you're kind of off to the races to go to number 2. I feel like sometimes people try to set those up more when it really is just kind of an ideal time. So I tend to be very stripped down, I guess is what I'm saying, with those kind of transitions. But yeah, he has, there are several ideas of, their preachers who are much more intentional about their transitions than I am, and will use mnemonic devices or other kinds of things in those moments. Yeah. Other thoughts from people just on anything we've talked about here so far? I'm going to let Sarah into the room soon. But
I just wanted to ask, I know that it was mentioned somewhere in the beginning of the book as far as like time for each day
Uh-huh.
to work on the sermon. What from your perspective, what would you say is like, I know it's probably different for each person, but
Sure.
what should we aim for as far as time taken each day to work on it?
Yeah, well, I think it's going to look different if depending on your role in ministry and how often you're doing this. I think, as he's talking about this from a person who's preaching every week, and I think it's the kind of thing where different people are going to have to take more time on some days than others. So if you're, for me anyway, the intuitive ones are days 2 and 4. Those are the things that are more or less easy for me. What I'm less skilled at, I'm not a Bible scholar. And so days 1 and 3 are the days that I've got to take more time to do more research to really make sure that I'm not just reading my own expectations onto the text. So for me, the text days take longer because there's more technical work to be done in that. And just to be clear, I don't do this now in terms of having one day with each text. Like that's not my approach now. But in general, the text stuff takes me longer than the comparing to our own lives situation. Does that? So I think for you it may be different depending on your own background and your own skill set. I think he would encourage you to take an hour or two a day to kind of work on that. But for me, I mean, some preachers will plan out their sermons, a few months in advance and take a retreat day or a retreat week where they write up a lot of pages 1 and 3 of a lot of texts, and do a lot of that work kind of at once. And then they don't need to be doing quite all of it in the same way each week. Does that make sense? Yeah. Any other questions, thoughts? Well, I'll ask something related to this in the discussion board too, so I'll keep an eye on that. And if there are things you want to know, just feel free to shoot me an email during the week. But why don't I go ahead and let Sarah in now? Professor Dirk. If you're there, you're muted.
Good evening.
There you are. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. It's good to see you all.
Good to see you.
Hello, hello.
Yep. So this is Preaching in the Church. And I don't know, Sarah, I don't know if I told you, we're using a book called The 4 Pages of the Sermon. Is that a text you're familiar with?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Yeah. So we've been taking today to talk about trouble in the text and trouble in the world.
Right.
And you're not emblematic of that trouble or anything. I mean, it's just it's sheer chance that you're here. But we're glad to have you. And students have watched, and I've watched the sermon that you sent along. So we'll just ask you to share a little bit about that. And then I'll have a few questions just about kind of your own preparation process. You're the first guest, so we're not into a theme we're not into a good rhythm as a class yet, but I've also told them that if they have questions for you, they can ask them as well. So
absolutely, yeah.
But first, why don't you just tell us a little bit about the sermon we heard, the situation where it was, the time, place, the people, and maybe why you chose this one for us to listen to.
Sure. So the sermon was sorry.
Sorry.
Thank
Hey,
you.
Josh.
That's my husband. He very kindly offered to make me a cup of tea.
Oh, he also just replaced my car battery. So talk about what a man, what a man,
right.
what a
Yeah,
man.
that's right.
We're
He's a keeper.
appreciative of him. Yeah, he's a good man.
So this was an invitation to preach at the church where I hold my my membership up in Rochester, and I preach there 2 or 3 times a year. This one it's a Church of the Nazarene, which is where my ordination is in, and it was part of a series on the I Am statements of John, and this I got to pick which one I wanted to preach on, and I have been wanting to wrestle with the I Am of the way, the truth, and the life for a while, so I went ahead and dove in for that one. The congregation is around 200 people, mostly suburban blue collar folks, mostly white, mostly, let's see, average age. There were not too many kids in the audience. I think on that particular Sunday they were doing something else, so it was mostly adults. but ranged from college age all the way up until the very elderly. So
Mhm. Can I ask you, Sarah, just so it was fairly recent, correct? So, I mean, it was like February or something.
yeah,
Uh, were they still doing online? Like, did you expect that there was an online live audience as well? Or, I mean, it was
there
obviously
was.
recorded, but
Yeah, yeah,
okay.
yeah. There was. Sorry, I said Rochester. I meant Springwater.
Okay.
um, and uh, yes, there was. It was live stream. So the congregation was about 200, but there were probably about 100 in the sanctuary, and then others online, YouTube and Facebook Live. Yeah. So it was a congregation that knows me a bit. It's not the place where we worship on a weekly basis, but just because of the distance. But they know me, they know my family a bit, and um, I've preached there, so it's wasn't my first time in that particular pulpit, which is always a little bit of a different experience. It's nice to be able to return to a congregation that you know.
Mhm.
In my particular line of work, my main focus of ministry is with students, and so I don't have the privilege of preaching week to week. So that's sort of a little bit about my context,
Yeah.
how I
Thanks.
arrived at that passage. Yeah.
I should, and I didn't, of course, didn't think to do this when I introduced you because I know that you're an Old Testament professor at Houghton, but others may not know that. So, yeah. So Sarah, I mean, speaks in chapel once every semester or a year for us. I mean, somewhere around there. A really gifted preacher, but how often? I mean, you preach maybe 10 times a year, Sarah. Is that about right? Or
Probably about an average of once a month.
oh, okay, yep,
Yeah.
yep, so a little more, but
Yeah.
all right. So talk to us about your preparation process. And again, part of what I'm trying to make clear with people is 4 pages are helpful for me, but that doesn't need to be everybody. And it helps to have a lot of different voices who kind of approach it differently. So how do you go from just like dreaming up an idea to finished product, what we saw?
Mm-hmm. So my habit is to start with the passage. I always try to have an extended passage, and my preference, since I do so much pulpit supply and invited preaching, my preference is actually to be assigned a passage. If I'm not assigned a passage, I will usually work my way through the lectionary texts for the week that I'm or for the date that I'm preaching, and choose one of those. So I always start with the passage, and the particular method of sermon prep that I learned in seminary is sort of like, it sounds very cliche, but sort of boiled down into a 10-step process. So I start with listening to the passage and trying to memorize it. I listen to the passage at least 5 times. I listen to someone reading it. Sometimes I record it myself and then listen to it over and over again. And at least those 5 times, I am listening one for each sense. So I'm thinking about, what do I hear in the passage? What do I see, smell, taste, feel in the passage? And then I'm trying to memorize it. So I'm trying to really get the passage deep into my being in an important way. And then I am, after that, I am asking questions of the passage. And so, what are people doing in the passage? What is God doing in the passage? How many different places in the passage could I stand? So if I'm dealing with a story from the gospel, if I am Jesus, that renders the event differently than if I'm standing with Peter, or if I'm standing with Mary, or if I'm standing with an onlooker, or if I'm one of the Pharisees, or et cetera, et cetera. So how many different places can I stand? What is God up to? What is God doing and saying? What are people doing and saying in the passage? What am I curious about? What are things I'm going to make some notes on that I know I need to go and do some research about? If there are terms or customs or theological ideas in the passage that I know I'm going to need to do a little bit more digging, I make note of that. So the first couple of steps are really about trying to enter the context of the passage in a deeply personal and imaginative way. Then I go looking for the trouble.
Mhm.
And so I'm kind of following that track that is described in the 4-page, the trouble in the text, the trouble in the world, um, the grace in the text, and the grace in the world.
Mhm.
Then I sit down with a blank sheet of paper, and by this time I have usually had 2 or 3 different major themes or images bubble to the top. So in this one, for instance, I was really struck by uh, how well Jesus seemed to know his disciples, and the ignorance with which they kept responding to him as though they didn't know him at all. And that question, do you not know me? Is like he's been asking that of them. And so I was thinking about, well, how do you know when you know someone? Like when you really, really know someone, you know what they smell like, right? Like the
Mhm.
people you know most intimately, you can associate a particular smell with them. And so that's where the image came to me. And so I sit down with this blank sheet of paper and I do like a bubble map. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but like with the idea in a circle in the center of knowing someone intimately, and then I'm like trying to make a map, an image map of all of the different ways that gets expressed in pop culture, in common experience, in movies, TVs, music, etc. I'm just this is a real brainstorming step, just kind of anything that is could help connect for the congregation to the image that I'm trying to get to there. In this particular instance, the connection happened. It clicked for me around that experience that I had of thinking I was smelling my mom.
Mhm.
And so that was really about, so the being known intimately was the image on my page, and then how that plays out in life, what was around in the image map around that. Then I moved to a step that's that my teacher called, my preaching prof called pausing to let the text do me good. And this is about where do I see the text? Where do I struggle with the text? Where do I struggle against the text? Where does the text feel flat to me? Are there places in the text that I personally resist? And if so, why? And I
Mhm.
kind of go to explore and reflect and meditate on some of those things myself, so that I'm aware of uh, the shadow side of my own issue around a text, so that I'm not, probably if you haven't heard the term yet, you will at some point, preaching from the basement.
Mhm.
There's basement preaching and balcony preaching. This idea of you want to preach from the best of you so that you can call forth the best from the congregation, rather than preaching to all of the things you hate about yourself.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
um, so that's the next step, and then at that point I go to the scholars. That's where I go to. I don't touch a reference book. I don't even read the study notes in my Bible until this stage, because at this point I am ready to take the ideas that I'm playing with and check them against other people's work, make sure I'm not missing a major idea from the passage or misrepresenting something just because I got inspired.
Mhm.
And so I'm consulting with references, with the scholars, commentaries, and things like that. Then I go to a step that's called exegeting the congregation, and that's where I try to think about representative people. If I know the congregation, if I don't, I usually try to ask. Usually try to ask about the congregation that I'll be preaching at as much as I can.
Mhm.
Um, so who's out there, and what are some of the experiences that an average person in this particular congregation might be dealing with, if I'm preaching to the college student body, for instance. Then I'm thinking about, how is a pre-med student going to hear this? How is an athlete going to hear this? How is a ministry student going to hear this, et cetera, et cetera. Then I try to, by this point, I should have a pretty good idea of the point of the sermon in a single sentence. And if I can't get the point of my sermon into a single sentence, then I have more work to do. So then I take that single sentence and I take all of this stuff that I've been working on. And by this time, usually things are starting to click together, connections are being made in my head, and I am thinking about what the shape of the sermon could be. And the 4 pages often comes into play here, but there are other genres and styles of sermons that I often will pick from as well. And then I start drafting. I'm a manuscript preacher. I don't very often, I can't remember the last time I literally read a sermon word for word, but I've got the whole thing written out there. And I am always tweaking it on the fly. But with the whole thing written out, then I actually feel quite a bit more free to engage with the congregation. So I start drafting. Now this, my goal is to have the first 5 or 6 steps done on Monday if I'm preaching on the following Sunday, so that then I can spend the rest of the week, sort of letting it all simmer, and inevitably appropriate encounters, related conversations, illustrations happen in that week. It's just the nature of the beast that when you're thinking about something, you begin to make connections to what you're thinking about throughout your week. So my goal is, ideally, I like to have a dedicated sermon prep time on a Monday if I'm preaching on Sunday, and then I let it sit, and then I want a draft by Friday if possible. And then again, I don't do anything with it on Saturday, and usually I have a few last minute things to change in my manuscript on Sunday morning before I preach. So that's my process.
Yeah, thanks. And it's funny you say that about the Sunday morning thing. I'm absolutely that way too, especially if I'm guest preaching somewhere and I get there and I realize like, this is a little different than I thought. And I'll like strike whole directions, and it's Sunday morning can be wild, but
yeah. For me, what's odd is I usually don't end up writing the end of the sermon. Like I get to about 4/5 of the way through, and then the last bit of the sermon is almost always extemporaneous for me. I don't know why. I usually get to the point in the draft where I think, okay, I can see several different directions that the service itself might lead from here. So I'm going to leave that part open.
Interesting. Yeah, I'll have to think that over. I'll just tell my class this: I am least confident in my own concluding skills too. Like I don't like sermon conclusions. And so maybe I'll make sure that one of our guests who come on specializes in conclusions or something. But yeah.
I wonder if this is a generational thing actually.
I don't know.
In American preaching, because in our traditions anyway, Mike, we've reacted so strongly against the altar call manipulative kind of, or the manipulative version of the altar call, that we don't know how to end a sermon.
Well, that's probably true, right? There's like a void of the script, like we're just not sure if it's not that, then what is it? So yeah, I hope that y'all were listening to I think particularly, I mean, there are all kinds of ways in which you could have gotten a lot of good stuff there, but particularly the overlap, I think, between the kind of self-awareness piece, like we were talking about before, like we were just talking about, Sarah, it's so much easier to see trouble in the world when you're really acquainted with the trouble that's going on inside of you. And instead of trying to run it away or keep it at arm's length, if you know what's there, it becomes much easier to sort of see it in the text and see it in the world in a way that's really authentic and powerful. So thanks for sharing. That's a much more, I don't know. I can see why you teach this class sometimes. It's a much more precise way of doing this than I have. I don't have this 10 steps. That's very good. So that's
well,
Yeah, go
My
ahead.
preaching prof has since turned it into a textbook. So if you want the
Oh,
reference, I
okay.
can
Yeah, no, I
send you
mean,
the link on Amazon.
it's probably not a bad idea to just have a bibliography of things, because like I say, I mean, different people just intuit some of the same ideas differently and extrapolate them out in different ways. But yeah, let me just ask, I mean, one of the questions I wanted to make sure I ask all the people who visit is, how do you understand your gift as a preacher? Like, when you think this is what I bring to the task that is uniquely me, that other people don't do quite like me. Other people might draw their own conclusions about your gift. What do you think it is, Sarah? Like,
Um, well, I guess first of all, I'll just say I'm sort of basing this on feedback that I've gotten over the years. People tend to tell me that I have a way of saying hard things in ways that people can hear without feeling defensive. So I don't know whether it's like the motherly part of me or what, but I can and maybe there's something about a female preacher who can kind of sneak in under people's radar a little bit. So I don't really pull any punches in my sermons. I'm not sort of tiptoeing around the hard truths, and I am quite comfortable calling people to account and asking them to investigate with Jesus where they need to make changes. But I guess I think I have a way of doing that in a non-abrasively. I guess I'll just put it that way. And then the other thing that I get a lot of feedback about and that I really enjoy about preaching is I love to bring particularly the Old Testament alive, and to bring some real deep connection between the Old and the New Testaments. So even though I'm an Old Testament prof and I often gravitate towards the Old Testament texts, I will almost never preach a sermon from only one testament. I will have a primary passage and then a corresponding passage from the other testament and try to bring connection there.
that's interesting, because as you all can imagine, it's rather daunting. I mean, most Christian preachers are functionally New Testament preachers and a little bit afraid of preaching on the Old Testament anyway. And I always feel especially nervous about it when you're there, Sarah, because you know the Old Testament really well, and so I can't fake it in front of you. But you're right, you often do really make those connections between the two testaments in a way that I can have confidence that you're doing that with integrity. There are times when people don't do that necessarily with the most integrity, but
Sure.
knowing what you know and how you present it. So yeah, I think, I'd have to also, I appreciate your first comment about sharing hard truths in ways that are invitational. We've just been talking about, one of the things Wilson talks about in the book is moving from what he calls vertical trouble to horizontal trouble, saying, like, instead of saying, don't be so consumeristic or so greedy, sort of acknowledging the fear that makes consumerism and greed a logical response. I'm afraid there won't be enough.
Yeah.
And once we realize, oh, consumerism and greed are sinful but logical responses to the fact I might not have enough. And if I can sort of locate us here in this thing that says, we're all a little afraid, wouldn't we like to do better? I think I'd have to see if that's your MO or not, but it wouldn't surprise me if there's something there. Because I think you're right. I mean, I rarely leave a sermon that you've preached where I've thought she hasn't said something important. But it also doesn't feel like you've been through war to get there. It feels like I could be a better me on the other side of this. And that's, yeah. So I think you're right. That is part of your gift. So. Tell us about your inspirations, like who taught you to preach? What, when you think about the people who impacted you, who are they? What did they teach you?
I grew up in a family of preachers. I think one time we sat around at a family reunion and counted, and there were 21 pastors in the living generations of our family. So I really did just grow up hearing sermons all the time. We would go to visit my grandparents in the summer, and part of what we would do would be to accompany my grandfather to the camp meeting where he was preaching. So I grew up hearing sermon after sermon after sermon. Not all of them great, obviously. But I honestly, I think that part of my preaching lab as in my childhood was to hear preachers talk about the sermons that they had just heard. for good or for ill. And so I learned as much what to do as what not to do in that regard. And then I just had some phenomenal preachers as pastors over the years, especially during my graduate school years when I was first beginning to consider the call to preach. Oddly enough, I went to seminary. I did 3 years at seminary, and then God finally got through to me about the call to preach in my last semester at seminary. So I sort of did things backwards. I graduated from seminary, and then I went back and did preaching and some other classes that I had not taken in my program. So I think some of my seminary profs and some of family members and family pastors over the years. The first sort of nationally known preacher that I remember being enthralled by was Barbara Brown Taylor. As a young woman in seminary, she was kind of every young woman's preaching hero because she was the first woman who sort of was a nationally known name. And that was before she had her divorce and remarriage with the church, I guess, to put it sort of like that. So yeah, I guess those would be some of the experiences that I would point to.
Thanks. Questions from the group for Sarah? Anything you heard that you want to know more about, or anything about her process?
You mentioned earlier how you enjoy, if you know what the text of the scripture is, you're assigned that. Why is that? You normally are surprised by it sometimes, maybe?
I enjoy the challenge of needing to hear God on behalf of a congregation from a text that I didn't choose. Sometimes I feel like left to my own devices, I would, let me put it this way. I've had occasions when I have chosen texts that I was interested in, but that really didn't end up having a lot for the need of the congregation in the moment. So since I'm usually being invited into a congregation, I prefer to know what their pastor thinks would be useful. So especially in this instance, I was a part of a sermon series. That's a very common thing for a pastor to say, hey, we're doing this series on X, would you come and contribute to it? The lectionary choice, if someone doesn't give me one, then I will go to the lectionary, because I value, just personally, I value the experience of wrestling with a text or with a set of texts that I know Christians are wrestling with around the world that week. Like, that's just really appealing to me. So it's part just enjoying the challenge of it. It's part having a sense that this is probably likely to be something that the congregation needs in the moment, or and then sometimes it's just, this is the text for the church worldwide this week, and this is what I want to be wrestling with. So yeah,
I guess it's just such an odd thing for me, because it just seemed like a organized structure to something. I've always been around smaller churches with usually a single pastor. So if they have a series, it's usually them doing a series, and they enjoy doing the 4 or 5 or 6 week long series. And every week, it seems like their text is based on the needs of the congregation or something that they see, So they have something assigned. It just seems kind of strange to be able to say, okay, you're going to preach on this text. And you're like, oh, well, that one, huh? It's off guard, I guess.
Well, I have to say that has happened to me before. This last summer, I don't remember how I came to it, but somehow I ended up needing to prepare a sermon from Genesis 22, which is the near sacrifice sacrifice of Isaac.
Mhm.
Oh, I have dreaded that passage as a preacher. I would never have chosen it myself. I, even as a professional biblical scholar, don't necessarily know what to make of that passage in many ways, and I never would have chosen to preach from it.
Did Wes ask you to preach on it? Or is it the lectionary text?
I
Sorry.
can't remember.
Okay, all right.
I can't remember how.
That's okay. Yeah. It was a great sermon, but
It turned out to be one of the sermons in my life that I am the most satisfied with.
Yep.
Because I had to wrestle it to the ground. I had to, and I wouldn't have chosen that.
Mhm.
I just am suspicious. Now, I'm not saying that you need to take this on, Brian. I'm just saying that for myself, I'm suspicious enough of my own motives in choosing a passage. I'd rather have someone else do that for me. I want to be pushed beyond my comfort zone as a preacher. I feel like I am more dependent on God when I am out there, not in my comfort zone. So that doesn't mean I don't have any insight into what a congregation could need. It just means in my particular context, that's what works for me.
I'll say for me too, Brian, what Sarah's talking about in terms of kind of enjoying the professional challenge of it is something I feel much more now than when I was starting to preach. You know, I would have been, I think, when I was learning to preach, I think it would have been a really scary thing to have that. And now it doesn't feel quite as scary to have someone sort of say, you know, could you preach on this? And I think, okay, yeah, I could do that. Whereas when I was starting, I would have felt overwhelmed by that. So it might just be something that changes as you develop too.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense.
Well, everybody, Sarah, I really appreciate your time here with us tonight. This has been really good. Anything additional you want to tell people here on the way out? Any last words of wisdom or encouragement?
I will just pass along the piece of advice that I was given, and that was never turn down the opportunity to preach.
That's good. Yep.
If someone invites you and you can do it in your schedule, say yes, whether you really want to or not. And I have followed that advice almost to a T for most of my life, and just been so blessed by the privilege to preach with the people of God. So, and I think sometimes people's invitations end up really being the leading of God.
You said that much nicer than Mike Walters was the fellow who taught me to preach. One of them, but he would always say, you know, don't ever turn down an opportunity to preach, because every preacher has 300 bad sermons in them. So he said, you just need to get them out of the way as quickly as possible. So always, which was much less hopeful than what you just said, Sarah. It was. I'd like to think.
So if I've preached 300 times in my life yet, so I'm still working on the bad.
You know, Mike. I don't know if anybody else on this call knows Mike. I mean, he's a little dour about that kind. I think he overshot it by a few. I don't think everyone has 200 bad sermons in them, but maybe he knew a few students who did. I don't know, but anyway, yeah. Sarah, it's so good to have you with us. Everybody, why don't we break now and just come back in about 15 minutes. We'll finish up with discussing. We're actually discussing the preaching life, Sarah. So we're doing Barbara Brown Taylor stuff now. So
great.
We'll look forward to discussing that in about 15. Sarah, we'll see you later.
All right, bye everybody.
All right, let's come on back together here and we'll finish up for the evening. Yeah. Get here. So what I want to do, I'm not sure if you've all gotten into this book yet. I'm assuming that you have. We've been reading, the first half of this book is short chapters kind of about topics related to preaching and the call to preach, that kind of thing. And then the second half are sample sermons. And I just want us to take some time each week. This is going to be different than the focus of the 4 pages and the other things we'll be reading, which are a little more technical and more, this is more just kind of, I don't know how to put it. It's more broad, more free ranging and wanting us to think about the personal aspects of both ministry and preaching. As Sarah alluded to when we were last together, Barbara Brown Taylor had a well publicized kind of leaving ministry moment a few years ago. It's not entirely clear what all went into that. She retains her ordination and still is a Christian as far as we know, but has decided not to practice church ministry for the time being. Nonetheless, this book has always been one. I mean, it's one that's kind of a classic. As Sarah said, I'm sure that she read this when she was in seminary, and that's kind of how she got connected with Barbara Brown Taylor. Her writing is just helpful, thoughtful, provocative, and earthy and different than most kind of writing about preaching. So what I wanted to do is just take some time each week to kind of walk through these. And we didn't look last week at A Church in Ruins. That's the first chapter, but I would like to look at it a little bit with you. So each week I'll just come with a few discussion questions from this to think through. So if you look with me on page 8 in here, let me just read for you the paragraph that's in the middle of page 8. But down in the darkness, well, actually, let me go up a little further. The first full paragraph on page 8. His disillusionment is emblematic of the post-Christian era, when the perceived promises of Christendom lie broken, and the existence of God, never mind the omnipotence of God, seems a fantasy. Television evangelists are indicted for fraud, and parish priests for child molestation. Churches pour their resources into institutional survival while numbers dwindle. Religious wars are waged around the world while children's bellies bloat and whole species disappear off the face of the earth. These are grim times. And she describes this as times of feeling disillusioned. And she goes into that in the next paragraph. Disillusionment is the loss of illusion about ourselves, about the world, and about God. And while it's almost always painful, it's not a bad thing to lose the lies we have mistaken for the truth. Disillusioned, we come to understand that God does not conform to our expectations. A little further down, disillusioned, we find out what is not true and are set free to seek what is, if we dare. So I think the first thing I wanted us to think about is, she is saying what to preach. And this book is written in 1993. Keep in mind, it's 30 years old at this point, which is almost astounding to say about 1993. But so this is where we are. But, she's saying basically to be modern is to be disillusioned, that the old sort of understanding of and cultural consensus about God has passed away. And now people are disillusioned. That illusion has been removed from them. So first question is, would you still say people are disillusioned today, 30 years later? And if so, what difference do you think it should make that we're preaching to disillusioned people? How should preaching look if preaching is done to disillusioned people? Think of it in terms of what we've just talked about, in terms of the problems of the world. If we're speaking to people for whom part of the reality is, I can't believe the old illusions about God anymore, how does that shape the way that we should preach?
I think on one hand, it actually benefits the preaching, because typically there's if there was the illusion, and there may have been 50 years ago in America, there may have been, gosh, 50 might not even be enough, but there may have been a time where just accepted, I'll call them illusions, but just seeing Christianity as just the way we do things, and we just do this on Sunday, and this is our religion. I think there is a benefit of coming out of the illusion that I think she was talking about in, you're in school and everyone just understands that if I pray to God and behave, then he will be good to me. So I think coming out of that benefits the truth of the scripture, and we can be more honest rather than being worried about keeping up people's expectations, because there's a sense of kind of relief that we don't need to keep up that act anymore. And I think like this disillusionment, I am not even gonna try.
Fine.
I think like I've kind of been going through it in the past like year or two. And I think being able to speak and write and just be more honest, I think it's helpful. How she said like it's not a bad thing to lose the lies we've mistaken for the truth. So I think we can move away from the lies that we've accepted as like an entire Christian culture, and help us to move towards just the truth of Scripture. And I really liked your point of putting one foot ahead of the other is the best way to survive disillusionment, because the real danger is not the territory itself, but getting stuck in it. So I think, to actually answer the question instead of ramble, moving forward, like I think that's a great responsibility as a preacher to help the congregation move forward in this collective disillusionment, rather than just kind of pretend that it's not happening and keep up any acts. Like it's much more, it's more honest, I think, if we can just acknowledge it.
It's good. It's interesting. I mean, you wonder her take on it. It would be interesting to talk to her. I mean, just sort of say 30 years later, does this disillusionment look like you expected, or what other things have happened since then that, have new illusions risen in its place than just the kind of 50s and 60s, early 60s kind of thing that, but yeah, I appreciate you talking about the importance of not getting stuck in it. I think the reason that many people get nervous when we start talking about disillusioned preachers is the idea that, preachers who won't be able to talk confidently about what the scriptures say or what they believe. But to say no, like, but the fact that I'm not living in a fantasy doesn't disqualify me from preaching, but actually makes me more equipped to speak something that's more truthful. So it's good. Yeah, thank you. She talks on the next page about curiosity on page 9. And I just, I'm curious, curious. I go back and forth with this question myself, but do you think people are really curious about God? She sort of wants to say, basically people are deep down looking for something. And there are days I go to preach where I really believe that. And then there are days I'm like, I don't know if people are really looking for it at all. So yeah, what do you think? Like, are people genuinely curious about God when they come to our churches to listen to us preach? And do you think it's our job to inspire curiosity, or do you think it's our job to kind of relieve curiosity? How do you see that? Like, as a preacher, is your job to inspire people toward a curious posture about God, or is our job to answer the questions people have? Joe, did you want to say something?
Well, I mean, actually, I think it's both. You should inspire them to seek God more while you're answering their questions. Because sometimes I have to wonder at myself, like, because, with technology and everything today, and everything being so convenient and at your fingertips, your plastic will get you just about anything you want, except for that happiness that you're really seeking. So as a last resort, maybe they're coming to church seeking what they're missing, that happiness, or that love they're looking for. So I kind of think it's both. They're there curious. You want to kind of guide them. You want to inspire them to seek out more, be more curious about God and what God can do for them in their lives, and how God is possibly a better direction, because what they're seeking right now is only temporary. We want to show them there's an everlasting life that's waiting for them.
No, that's good. I I appreciate you talking about how people get to that point sometimes where they are curious, like life makes them that way because something has happened that's really devastating to them. And the way that I kind of resolve this question for me is if there's someone who is curious, I want to make sure that I'm speaking to them. You know, like I, as a preacher, I don't want to miss the moment for that person who knows that they're needy and gets that right now they need a word from the Lord. And so I don't want to be too jaded about it, you know?
But you can't have me thinking at the same time when you ask that question, going back to your previous, what we were talking about just previously.
Disillusionment, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because maybe they are becoming disillusioned on what they should actually be seeking. And I was thinking, because how earlier when we was talking about how, like, a lot of times you're in church today, and a lot of times they will seem to focus on the New Testament. You've heard these New Testament sermons over and over. I'm thinking, and I'm thinking now is the time that we actually should go back to the Old Testament, where they was actually trying to introduce them to God, get them away from their gods. So the plastic, today is kind of like people's God that they're idolizing. So now we're trying maybe have to take them back to the Old Testament and say, hey, look, here's the way the Old Testament life was like. But then also at the same time, move them over to the New Testament, try to connect that old with the new, say, but look, but again, God gave us even greater gift. He gave us Jesus Christ, to bring us that love and joy that you're probably seeking.
Yeah, connecting people's felt needs to the real needs of their heart. Yeah. Jeanette, did you want to say something before? It looked like you were getting ready to say something.
I wasn't hitting my unmute button fast enough.
That's all right. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's a balance with the preacher to know when to give the answers and then when to create that hunger, like that desire within your people to want to seek more, right? Because you always want to teach your people to delve into the word and feed themselves. So I just think of, just creating that hunger and that taste so that they do want to go after it.
Yeah, I appreciate you using the language of feed themselves too. That kind of language is very common, and I think it is good, right? I mean, it's that very fine line between sort of, if we want to extend the feeding metaphor, to know that every time you come to this table, there will be something worth partaking in, but that also you don't have to be dependent on me. Like this is God's goodness. This isn't just my own homiletical skill or my magnetic personality. If that's what we're doing, it's not enough either. So yeah, you want to develop that kind of ability and develop that confidence in them to know when I'm curious, I can learn. I can develop on my own. Yeah, it's good. Brian, anything to add? It looked like you were also jumping in, but
I just wanted to speak on the curiosity thing. I think people are still curious about God, but I think we have more of a unpersonal part of it because they don't want to come to church to find out about God. They want to be able to use social resources and stuff because they're uncomfortable around people either not knowing about God, being embarrassed by it. And, it's hard to be a pastor or a preacher to try to make people curious about God when you can't connect with them in person, I guess. But I see that a lot. I mean, we see that a lot with our kids where they want to know more about something, but they're embarrassed of being embarrassed by not knowing it. So they just seek other avenues.
Yeah, thanks for raising that. That's a really important point. And I think it's always, I shouldn't say always, it's certainly been true throughout my life where I've seen that, that people are kind of intimidated by Christians who are practicing Christians and feel like they don't know the lingo or they don't know. But in recent years, it really has changed. We have become a culture that if you want to know something, we generally don't ask someone else, but we consult. We figure it out on our own. We consult Google. We have ways of learning things, and I'm not throwing that under the bus. I'm just saying like the way that we're doing this is kind of fundamentally changing, and so feeling like I don't have the answers or I'm not put together does feel even more threatening than it used to. I think I don't want to be an unfinished product in front of somebody, and that's something the church will need to reckon with in some ways, Brian. I think it's it's not something that I think we can even undo on our own. I think it's a much broader thing than just we Christians are screwing it up. I think the whole culture is kind of changing about the way that we learn these things. And for them to find the church as a reliable, safe place is really, it's pretty important. So good. Curious just your take toward the end of chapter 1, page 12, she talks about the task of preaching, and I wonder how it sounds to you. This is the end of the second to last paragraph. Our job is to stand with one foot on earth and one in heaven, with the double vision that is the gift of faith, and to stay out of our own experience that reality is not flat but deep, not opaque but transparent, not meaningless but shot full of grace for those with the least willingness to believe it is so. So that could be just a beautiful confection of a sentence that doesn't mean anything, or it might mean something. I'm wondering your take, like, does that sound like, when you think about the job of a preacher, to stand with one foot on earth and one foot in heaven, and to kind of announce that this is accessible, that God is real, close by, and that our reality is kind of enchanted instead of disenchanted, you know, like there's actually a God who deeply loves us. I don't know, does this sound like preaching to you? Or, you know, I'm just curious what you make of this sentence. Does it draw you in, or does it repel you? I'm curious your take on it.
I think looking at it from a preacher's side of view, it kind of lifts you up higher than I think you need to be. And if you have that, but also from a congregational point of view, I think it's going to depend whether you are a new believer, a non-believer, or a experienced believer, how you take that, I guess, because how you absorb the message is going to give you whether or not, how you absorb it, I guess, because from being a non-believer and hearing that, you're not going to know how to take some of the things that are going to be said about God, you know, until you understand.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that's probably very common for people to meet Barbara Brown Taylor, is that I think she is a mystic and probably strikes some people as a little bit alarming. Like you said, I mean, it's just like, it's a lot to imagine that this person has one foot in the earth and one foot in heaven. And she is speaking not just of preachers, but of all Christians here, as being people who kind of walk in the world this way. But yeah, some people that really draws them in, and then some people, like Brian, I mean, I don't know much about your men's ministry, that you've always talked about being connected with men's ministry. It's hard for me to imagine. I mean, again, I don't know what it's like, but I might not lead with this if you asked me to come speak to your group about what it means to be a Christian. I might not certainly it's about having one foot on earth and one foot in heaven. Like, that might just seem a little disengaged somehow. But I don't know. Other thoughts on this? Does it draw you in? Does it repel you?
It seems a little too confusing to me. Like, it seems a little complicated, or I don't know. I would like to think of it in simpler terms, but still being very reverent for what being a Christian or preaching is.
Yeah, thanks. It's yeah. I think, like with all, I think each of us has our own experience, which is hard to kind of communicate to other people. But hers is quite ethereal. Like, it's really, and it's beautiful in a way, but it is also, it's a little much, I think, to carry around. Let me just jump into chapter 2 just a little bit. One of the questions I had on this is just about her calling. And one of the points that she makes is that her call to preach is related to her early Christian experience. And that's just something that I'd like to percolate on with you a little bit. Like, she has experiences that are all over the map. Like, she kind of grows up in this family where the faith is kind of nominal. Father is Catholic, mother's Methodist. They attend a Methodist church kind of out of duty. She becomes fiercely enchanted by this one young pastor who comes to their church because of the way he seems to really listen to her. I don't know, I'm just thinking, I read this the first time when I was 21, but now that I have daughters this age, I know the power of a person who just listens to them and takes them very seriously. And so as I read this, I'm thinking, like, of course she's really drawn into this, and then this pastor comes out being in favor of civil rights, which was not something that in Kansas in that day was uncontroversial. And so he ends up leaving kind of in disgrace. And so she she ends up seeing both sides of the church, and she's drawn to this person who apparently has such time for her, but she's also really alarmed at the way he's treated. Like, he seems to say things that are powerful, that hit people in ways that they, you know, I think that probably is attracting her, but also concerning her about the preaching life. And then she talks about going to college, and, you know, many of her friends are sort of dropping out and doing drugs and stuff and protesting, but she's drawn into the life of the church. She talks about her grandmother. I mean, just all these people who, you know, for her kind of inform her sense of this is what it means to be a Christian. And this early Christian experience then, like, ties into her sense of feeling. Like, she's able to recount these stories as being tied to her call. Does that make sense? Like, these are the people that have taught her how to be a Christian. And in these experiences, she sees something of what it means, not just to follow Jesus, but to proclaim the word of God, including this like terrifying story from this woman who was kind of a caretaker of hers, who says basically, like, draw this picture of the house with the white picket fence and the dogs. And then it's on page 19 where she says, after you've drawn this picture, she said, now draw the whole sky on fire and that pretty white house going up in flames, because that's how it's going to be when the end times come. So, you know, she understands herself, I think, as a product of all these religious experiences, some of which are like over the top, but she feels kind of at home in them. And I guess the question I have for you, and then we'll just leave it here this week, is just, do you, like, when you think about whether or not you're called to be a preacher, do you view it as being connected to your kind of early Christian experience, or do you think of the call to ministry as something that's entirely separate from that call to become a Christian? Does that make sense? Because when I was growing up, I didn't understand the call to ministry as being connected to my early Christian experience at all. I thought, okay, I had this early Christian experience, and now I got to find out if I'm called to ministry. For her, it all seems to bleed together. And I'm just wondering, like, what it looks like for you. Do you think of it all bleeding together, or do you think of them as being very distinct? Those of you who feel called to ministry, is that something that, as you look back, you can see from the very start God was calling you, or was there a moment where that happened?
I mean, I don't know if it's a woman thing, but I can see how, like, looking back of how God just like from very young of God just plotting all of these different people in my life, and different things that were said to me, things that I didn't take seriously, like experiences that I had that I was just like, no. No, right. But now I can look back and go, gosh, like, God, you really did that. Like purpose in it. And now that things are coming to fruition, it was like, you know, I'm 41. So it wasn't until, you know, maybe 7 years ago that I really felt that call strongly on my life, and was like, okay, like, you know, I need to move in this, right? But yeah, I can go right back to my childhood and see all these different stepping stones, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think, I don't know if it's a woman thing either, but I think that way of narrating it and sort of realizing God's providential hand along the way is really a wonderful thing if we can have it. For me, I know when I read the story, like I said, it inspired me to start thinking about ways in which that might have happened along the way, rather than stressing out. You know, when I was reading this when I was 21, it was like, is God calling me or not? Is God calling me or not? Have I heard the call or not? As opposed to thinking through, like, what has God told me about me and him steadily along? And how might this be building towards something where it's, you know, her understanding of her call, and we can talk about this more next week, is intimately connected to God makes me a certain kind of person instead of giving me a certain kind of job. And so because of that, it's easier for her to understand all of these processes that have made her that kind of person as being connected to it. Anyway, you all have done enough thinking tonight. Thank you so much for your kind attention. We do not have a guest next week, but we're going to take a little, probably the time that Sarah took today as a guest, we're going to use to break up, like I said, break up into smaller groups and kind of work through a few different texts to kind of write out the 4 pages and then kind of share our learning with each other. So that's kind of what we'll do next week. We'll look at grace in the world, and then we'll take some time to break down some passages. Until then, I'll see you. Any final questions before we go? All right, love to you all. I'm going for a run. I'll see you later.